version of this story that most people will never hear. Not because it was kept secret, but because it happened in the kind of silence that wealth creates. The kind of silence that fills a room when someone walks past another human being and decides, without a single word, that that person does not deserve their attention. That is where this story begins. Not in a boardroom, not in a courtroom, not in any of the places you would expect a story this significant to start. It begins at a mop bucket, in a hallway, at a private estate in Connecticut. And it begins with a man who was completely deliberately invisible. His name, for the purpose of this story, was Robert Hill. That is what the name tag on his gray uniform said. Robert Hill, maintenance staff, hired through a third-party staffing agency, cleared for weekend work at the Whitfield family estate during their annual gathering. Nobody questioned him. Nobody looked at him twice. Nobody asked where he came from or what his story was. That is the thing about wearing a uniform in a place like that. You stop being a person. You become part of the furniture. And for 3 days, that is exactly what this man needed to be. But here is what nobody at that estate understood. Not the caterers, not the guests in their blazers and cocktail dresses, not the young woman who walked past him 4 separate times on the first morning without once making eye contact. The man behind that name tag was not Robert Hill. His real name was Gerald Whitfield. And Gerald Whitfield was, by any measure, one of the most financially powerful private citizens in the northeastern United States. A man whose personal net worth sat somewhere north of $400 million. A man who had built that wealth over 4 decades through commercial real estate, private equity, and the kind of disciplined, long-term thinking that most people talk about, but very few actually practice. A man who had been profiled in Forbes, who had turned down the cover, who had more reasons than almost anyone alive to simply let someone else handle this problem. And yet here he was, mop in hand, name tag on, completely anonymous, because there are questions that money cannot answer for you. And the one question keeping Gerald Whitfield awake at night was the one that mattered most. Did she love his son, or did she love what came with him? Stay with me through this story. Because what you are about to hear over the next 60 minutes is not a simple tale of a father exposing a woman. That would be too easy. That would be a headline, not a story. What this actually is, when you follow it all the way to its end, is one of the most complicated, emotionally honest accounts of what happens when 2 people who both carry deep wounds try to love each other, and what happens when a third person, watching from the outside, decides he can no longer pretend he does not see what he sees. The janitor walked in as a janitor. 3 days later, something happened that changed every person in that house, and I promise you, the way it ends is not what you are expecting. Before we go any further, let us pause on the 3 questions that this entire story turns on. Because a story this layered, with this many competing truths and this many people who are simultaneously right and wrong, needs you to understand what you are actually watching for. The first question is the one that Gerald Whitfield himself was asking from the moment he put on that uniform. Why would one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut spend 3 days pretending to clean floors at his own family estate? The answer to that question is not as simple as suspicion. It is rooted in a loss that never fully healed, in a promise he made to himself at a graveside 7 years before this weekend, and in a small, quiet moment he witnessed at his son's apartment 8 months earlier. A moment so easy to dismiss that most people would have let it go without a second thought. Gerald Whitfield did not let it go. And that refusal to look away from something that felt wrong is ultimately what brought him to that hallway with that mop. The second question is the one that will follow you through the rest of this story like a shadow. What did Victoria Calloway say and do over those 3 days that she believed no one important would ever witness? Because here is the thing about being tested without knowing you are being tested. You cannot prepare for it. You cannot perform your way through it. You can only be exactly what you are when you believe the stakes are low and the audience has gone home. And what Victoria was over those 3 days was not one single clean thing. She was not a villain. She was not a saint. She was a woman who was capable of being 2 entirely different people, depending on who she believed was watching. And the gap between those 2 versions of herself was precisely what Gerald had come to measure. It was also, as it turned out, far more complicated than he had anticipated. The third question is the one that will hit you hardest at the very end. When the disguise came off, when Gerald Whitfield walked back into that estate on the morning of the 4th day, not as Robert Hill, but as himself, in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, with a presence that changed the energy of the room the moment he entered it. What happened next? That is the question this story exists to answer. And the answer involves a moment of silence that lasted, by one account, nearly 30 seconds. 30 full seconds in which nobody in that dining room spoke. In which Victoria Calloway sat completely still. In which Marcus Whitfield, a man who had no idea any of this was happening, looked between his father and the woman he planned to marry and began, slowly and terribly, to understand that he was the only person in the room who did not know the whole truth. Before we go any deeper, we would love to know where you are watching this from. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. We read every single one, and it genuinely means everything to hear from this community. And if you are new here, and this story is already pulling you in, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We tell stories like this one regularly, human, complicated, and impossible to forget. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to Gerald Whitfield, not the billionaire, not the man in the uniform, but the father. Because to understand why he made the choice he made, you have to understand what it cost him to make it. And that story begins not at the estate, and not with Victoria, but with a woman named Margaret. The only person who ever made Gerald Whitfield believe he did not have to be invincible. Gerald Whitfield did not grow up with money. That is the first thing you need to understand about him, because it is the thing that explains nearly everything that comes after. He was born in 1963 in a small house in Akron, Ohio, the second of three sons raised by a woman named Dorothy who worked as a school cafeteria manager and a man named Harold who drove a delivery truck for a regional grocery chain. They were not poor in the way that makes headlines. They were poor in the quiet, invisible way that most working families in America understand, the way where there is always just enough, and the fear of not enough lives permanently in the back of every room. Gerald understood by the time he was 10 years old that if he wanted a different life, he was going to have to build it himself. Nobody was coming to hand it to him. And more importantly, he understood that the only way to truly build something is to understand every single layer of it, from the foundation up. He worked his first real job at 13, mowing lawns in his neighborhood for $5 a yard. By 16, he was doing small home repairs for elderly neighbors, painting fences, fixing gutters, replacing rotted wood on front porches, learning, without knowing it, the language of property that would eventually make him wealthy beyond anything his parents could have imagined. He earned a partial scholarship to Ohio State, put himself through the rest with part-time construction work, and graduated with a degree in business finance in 1985. His first real estate investment was a duplex in Columbus, bought at 24 with money he had saved over 3 years of living in a one-room apartment and eating one real meal a day. He rented both units, used the income to save for a second property, and never stopped. By 35, he had a portfolio of 42 units across 3 Ohio cities. By 45, he had moved into commercial real estate in the Northeast and was quietly, methodically, building the kind of wealth that does not make noise. Gerald was not a flashy man. He never wanted to be. He drove a modest car until his accountant told him it was hurting his credibility in certain rooms. He wore the same watch for 20 years before his son bought him a new one for his 60th birthday. He believed, with a conviction that bordered on philosophy, that the way a person treats the people beneath them in any hierarchy is the most accurate possible measure of who they really are. He had fired 2 partners over the course of his career for the same reason, not dishonesty in contracts, not bad numbers, but the way they spoke to assistants and service workers when they thought no one important was paying attention. He called it the invisible test. He had been administering it his entire adult life, in conference rooms and restaurants and hotel lobbies, without anyone ever knowing. It was who he was. Which is why, when the time came, the decision to put on a uniform and disappear into the background of his own estate felt less like a scheme and more like the only honest thing he knew how to do. He met Margaret Chen at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in Hartford in 1991. She was 27, he was 28. She was working as a commercial loan officer at a regional bank and had exactly zero interest in being impressed by a man who talked about money. She told him this within the first 15 minutes of their conversation, which was the moment Gerald knew he was going to spend the rest of his life with her. Margaret was the kind of person who made the people around her more honest simply by being present. She had a way of looking at you that made performance feel exhausting and transparency feel like relief. She matched Gerald's work ethic with her own. She matched his seriousness with a warmth that he had spent his whole life not knowing he was missing. They were married in 1993. Marcus was born in 1994. And for the next 22 years, the Whitfield family was, by every account from people who knew them, one of the genuinely good ones. Margaret died in the spring of 2017 from an aggressive form of ovarian cancer that was diagnosed at stage 3 and moved faster than any of them were prepared for. She was 53 years old. She had been healthy the year before. She had been laughing at Christmas. She was gone by April. Gerald sat with that grief in the private, sealed-off way that men of his generation often do. Functional on the outside, quietly devastated on the inside. Holding it together because Marcus needed him to, and because falling apart was not something he knew how to give himself permission to do. But he made a promise at her graveside. He has never spoken about it publicly. The people who were there that day say he stood for a long time after everyone else had stepped back. And when he rejoined the small gathering under the tent, his face had the expression of a man who had just made a decision. The kind of decision you do not explain. The kind you just carry. Marcus Whitfield grew up knowing his father was wealthy, but never knowing how wealthy, because Gerald made a deliberate and sustained effort to raise his son in as normal an environment as he could manage. Marcus went to public school through 8th grade. He had chores, he had a curfew. He worked a summer job at a hardware store when he was 15, Gerald's idea, and non-negotiable. Gerald wanted his son to know what it felt like to be on your feet for 8 hours, to be told what to do by someone who did not care whose father you were, to understand the dignity and the difficulty of work that most people in their tax bracket never come within a mile of. Marcus understood it. He carried it. He grew into a man who his friends described consistently with the same word: decent, not perfect, not effortlessly charming in the way of someone performing for an audience. Just genuinely, fundamentally decent, a man who remembered people's names, who showed up when things were hard, who did not measure people by their net worth because his father had spent his entire childhood teaching him not to. He graduated from Georgetown with a degree in urban policy and spent 3 years working for a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., focused on affordable housing development before joining the family business. He was not groomed for it. He was not pushed into it. Gerald told him once that the company would be there if he wanted it and would survive without him if he didn't, and that the only thing that mattered was that Marcus build a life he could respect. Marcus joined Whitfield Properties because he genuinely believed in what they built, because he had seen firsthand what thoughtful real estate development could do for communities, and because working alongside his father in the years after his mother died felt, he would later say, like the only way both of them survived that grief without completely losing themselves inside it. By the time he was 32, he was running the development division with a quiet competence that made the people who worked under him fiercely loyal. He was in every way the kind of man Margaret had hoped he would become, and Gerald saw his wife in him every single day. Which is exactly why, when Marcus fell in love with Victoria Calloway, Gerald paid attention. Victoria Calloway was born in 1997 in Memphis, Tennessee, the only child of a woman named Denise who worked double shifts as a home health aide, and a man named Ray, who left when Victoria was 4 and reappeared sporadically and unreliably for the next decade before disappearing for good. Denise Calloway was, by every account from people who knew her, a woman of extraordinary resilience and ordinary means. She kept a clean apartment. She kept her daughter fed. She worked herself to exhaustion on a regular basis so that Victoria could go to school in decent clothes and not feel the full weight of what they did not have. But children who grow up watching a parent sacrifice like that do not emerge from it without being changed. Victoria grew up understanding, at a cellular level, that security was not a given, that the ground beneath your feet could shift without warning, that the only reliable thing you could do was make yourself indispensable to the right people and the right rooms, because rooms have power, and the closer you are to power, the safer you are. This was not a cynical calculation. It was survival. It was what she learned by watching the world from the place where she stood in it. She put herself through the University of Tennessee on a combination of academic scholarships and financial aid, graduated with honors in hospitality management, and built a career in luxury hotel operations that took her from Nashville to Atlanta to New York City by the time she was 26. She was good at her work, genuinely good, not just presentable. She had the rare ability to read a room, to understand what people wanted before they articulated it, to make guests feel attended to without ever making them feel managed. It was a skill she had developed long before any job. She had been reading rooms since childhood, since the rooms were her mother's kitchen, and the people in them were landlords and bill collectors, and the occasional man her mother was hoping might stay. Victoria Calloway arrived in New York City in 2023 with a resume that impressed the right people and a social intelligence that opened the right doors. She met Marcus Whitfield at a charity gala in October of that year. And from the outside, from every angle that a normal person would look, it seemed like exactly the kind of meeting that changes two people's lives for the better. It was only from the inside, from the vantage point of a man who had spent his whole life watching what people do when they believe no one important is looking, that it looked like anything other than a love story. The moment that set everything in motion did not happen at the estate. It happened 8 months earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in March, at Marcus's apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Gerald had come home by unannounced, something he rarely did, but Marcus had been out of touch for a few days, and Gerald had wanted to check in the way fathers do when they are trying not to say they are worried. He let himself in with the spare key Marcus had given him years ago. He could hear Marcus in the back bedroom on a call. And from the kitchen, where Gerald stood setting down the bag of food he had brought, he heard Victoria's voice from the living room. Not loudly, not in a way that suggested she knew she was being overheard, talking on her own phone, her voice carrying just enough through the open layout of the apartment to reach him before he could decide whether to make his presence known. He did not catch the whole conversation. He caught fragments, the way you catch the words of a song playing in another room. But what he caught was enough. She was talking to someone she was comfortable with, someone she did not filter herself for. And in the space of about 90 seconds, she said 3 things that Gerald would turn over in his mind for the next 8 months. She said that Marcus was sweet, but that sweetness had a ceiling. She said that the lifestyle was everything she had worked toward. And she said, in the casual throwaway tone of someone who had not yet decided how serious they were, that she was not sure whether what she felt for Marcus was love or gratitude, and that she was not entirely certain there was a difference. Gerald set the bag of food down very quietly. He texted Marcus to say he had dropped something off and would call tomorrow. He walked out of the apartment, took the elevator down, and stood on the sidewalk on West 72nd Street for a long time before he hailed a cab. He did not tell Marcus what he had heard. He did not call an attorney. He did not do any of the things a different kind of man might have done. He went home, and he thought. He thought for 8 months. He watched them together at dinners, at holiday gatherings, at the occasional Sunday afternoon at his own home in Greenwich. He watched Marcus look at Victoria the way he had watched his father look at his mother, with a specific quality of attention that left no room for anything else, that unguarded version of love that makes a person visible in a way they usually spend their whole life trying to avoid. And he watched Victoria be, in those settings, genuinely warm and genuinely engaged and genuinely funny, and everything that a woman in love is supposed to be, which was precisely the problem, because Gerald had heard the other version of her, the one she became when she believed the audience had left. And the gap between those two versions was wide enough to drive a question through that he could not stop asking. The annual estate weekend was coming. The family gathering, 3 days, 30 guests, staff on site, the whole choreography of it. And Gerald made a decision that he knew was unconventional. A decision that he knew, if it went wrong, could cost him his son's trust and possibly his relationship entirely. He was going to find out the truth, not from the head of the table, not as himself, but from inside the walls as someone no one looked at twice. He arranged everything through an employment agency he had used before for estate staffing, asking his personal assistant, a woman named Clara who had worked for him for 19 years and who understood both his eccentricities and his reasons for them, to process the placement of one Robert Hill, maintenance staff, for the weekend of the gathering. Clara asked no questions. She processed the paperwork. She made sure Robert Hill's file was clean, his clearance was standard, and that nothing in it would cause a second look. Gerald sourced a uniform from a rental company in Bridgeport. He practiced the posture, slightly rounded, unassuming, the body language of a man who occupies space apologetically. He was, by any objective measure, a thorough and convincing Robert Hill. The fact that this was his own estate, that he knew every hallway, every supply closet, every back staircase, was both a practical advantage and a quietly strange emotional experience that he has since described as the loneliest 3 days of his adult life. Day 1 was a study in observation. He arrived early Friday morning with 2 other members of the maintenance crew, none of whom he knew personally. He introduced himself as Robert, smiled when smiled at, said as little as possible, and got to work. The guests began arriving mid-morning. Gerald restocked supply closets in the East Wing hallway, which gave him a clear sight line to the main entrance. He watched Victoria arrive with Marcus in the early afternoon. She was dressed beautifully, laughing as she came through the door, reaching out to embrace Gerald's sister-in-law Carol with both arms and genuine warmth. Marcus beamed beside her. Gerald watched from 30 feet away, his back partially turned, a roll of paper towels in one hand. Nothing in day one gave him anything he had not already seen. Victoria was gracious, engaged, charming. She remembered names, asked good questions, made the older relatives feel attended to. Gerald cleaned baseboards and listened and thought that maybe, he had misheard 8 months ago. Maybe the fragments he had caught that Tuesday evening in March had been taken out of context by the interpretive gravity of his own fear. Maybe this was exactly what it looked like. Then day two came, Saturday morning. The estate kitchen, a large, warm, stone-floored room that connected the main house to the service wing. The family's regular chef was preparing the late breakfast spread. Gerald had been assigned to restock the service wing supply cabinets, which required him to pass through the kitchen and into the back corridor every 40 minutes or so. At approximately 9:15 in the morning, on one of those passes, he came through the kitchen door to find it empty, except for the sound of a voice coming from the far side of the large center island. The chef had stepped out. The other staff were in the dining room, and Victoria Calloway was standing at the far counter with her back to the door, her phone to her ear, her voice low and relaxed and entirely certain that she was alone. Gerald understood immediately what was happening. He understood it not with his mind but with his body. The way you understand things when the weight of what you feared suddenly becomes real. He did not move. He did not announce himself. He stood just inside the kitchen door, half blocked by the open door frame, and he listened. She was talking to someone she called by a first name, a woman, a friend. The tone was the same tone he had heard that Tuesday evening in March. Unguarded, unperformed. The voice a person uses when they are completely certain no one who matters is close enough to hear. And what she said in the space of roughly 3 minutes was this. She said the estate was beautiful, but that the whole setup felt frozen in time, like an old man's idea of money. She said that Marcus's extended family was sweet but exhausting, that the aunts and cousins all had opinions and none of them had perspective. She said that Gerald, Marcus's father, whom she believed was dead, because Marcus had told her at some point that his father had passed, a detail whose origin would become significant later, would have obviously been a sentimental man, because the estate had the feeling of something preserved rather than lived in. And then, after a pause in which her friend apparently asked her something, she said the thing that stopped Gerald Whitfield completely. She said, "Marcus is kind. He genuinely is. But between you and me, if the portfolio weren't what it is, I would have moved on 2 years ago. You don't build a future with someone like Marcus because of passion, babe. You build it because the foundation is solid. And solid is a lot harder to find than love." Gerald Whitfield stood behind that kitchen door for the remainder of her call, which lasted another 90 seconds and covered nothing of further significance. He heard her laugh at something her friend said. He heard the call end. He heard her heels on the stone floor as she crossed the kitchen and exited through the opposite door into the corridor that led back to the main hall. And then he stood alone in the kitchen for a moment that he has since described, in the only account of this that has ever been made available, as feeling like the floor had dropped out from under the room. Not because he was surprised, exactly, but because there is a difference between fearing something and knowing it. Between the suspicion you live with and the confirmation you cannot put back. He had his answer. His son was in love with a woman who viewed him as a foundation, a practical choice, a solid bet. And Marcus, warm, decent, unguarded Marcus, who had his mother's way of loving people without an exit strategy, had no idea. The rest of Saturday was the hardest thing Gerald Whitfield had done in years, including the years following Margaret's death. He completed his shift. He restocked the supplies he had been assigned. He ate his lunch in the service staff break room and listened to the other workers talk about the weekend weather and a football game and something one of their kids had done at school. He was present enough not to raise suspicion and absent enough to be alone with everything he was carrying. That evening, the family gathered for dinner in the main dining room, the large candlelit room with the long oak table that Margaret had picked out at an estate auction in Vermont in 2001. Gerald stood near the service entry in his gray uniform and refilled water glasses and watched his son sit beside Victoria Calloway and lean toward her when she said something funny and look at her with the specific helpless tenderness of a man who is completely and entirely gone for someone. And Gerald thought, this is what it costs to know the truth. You have to watch your son glow for a woman who just told someone else he was a sound investment. You have to stand in your own dining room and not be able to say a word. You have to carry all of it alone until you decide what to do with it. He carried it through Saturday dinner. He carried it through the evening. He lay awake in a service wing room he had never slept in before in a house he had owned for 23 years, staring at a ceiling he recognized, and thought about what a father is supposed to do when the truth and his son's happiness are not the same thing. Sunday morning, day 3. Gerald was back in uniform by 6:30 a.m., which was earlier than required. He had not slept more than 2 hours. He had spent the pre-dawn hours in the service wing sitting room, a small, plain room with a folding chair and a coffee machine that he had installed 12 years ago for the overnight staff, thinking through every version of what he was going to do. He knew he could not act on a single overheard phone call. He knew that evidence in any domain, legal, personal, relational, needs to withstand the counter-argument. He had built his entire career on not making consequential decisions from a single data point. So on day 3, he watched differently. He was not passive, he was deliberate. He was looking for pattern, not incident. He needed to know whether what he had witnessed in that kitchen was an anomaly, a bad moment, a venting session, the kind of thing people say to their closest friends that does not reflect who they actually are, or whether it was the truth of Victoria Calloway expressed in the only setting where she felt safe to express it. What he found over the course of Sunday was not a clean verdict. It was something far more complicated and far more human, and in some ways far more difficult to know what to do with. He watched Victoria snap, briefly and quietly, but unmistakably, at one of the serving staff who brought the wrong beverage to the sunroom where she was sitting. The staff member apologized. Victoria smiled immediately, warmly, and said it was no problem at all, but the snap had been real. It had been the reflex of someone accustomed to having her expectations met, the gesture of someone who considered the people serving her to be an extension of the service rather than people in their own right. Gerald noted it. He did not write it down. He did not need to. He had a memory built from decades of paying attention to exactly this kind of detail. But then, 20 minutes later, he watched Victoria spend 45 minutes on the sunroom couch with Marcus's Aunt Ruth, who was 74 years old and had been dealing with the recent death of her husband of 50 years. Gerald passed the doorway 4 times during those 45 minutes. Each time, Victoria was in the same position, turned fully toward Ruth, one hand on the older woman's arm, her phone face down on the cushion beside her, not performing attention, giving it. Ruth was crying at one point, and Victoria did not flinch or reach for the kind of empty comfort that people offer when they want to be seen being kind. She sat with the grief. She let it exist without trying to fix it. Gerald stood outside that doorway for a moment longer than his assigned route required, and felt something shift in his understanding of who he was dealing with. This was not a woman who was simply bad. This was a woman who was capable of genuine warmth and genuine coldness in the same morning, in the same house, and the determining factor was not her character, it was her audience. That afternoon, Gerald made his way through the back gardens, assigned to check the outdoor equipment storage near the pool house, and came within 20 feet of Marcus and Victoria sitting together on the back terrace. They did not see him. He was in his uniform, he was at a distance, and he was carrying a bucket, which rendered him, as he had come to understand over 3 days, entirely invisible. He stood with his back to them, moving slowly, and he listened. What he heard was not a performance. It was a conversation between 2 people who were comfortable with each other in the specific, unremarkable way of people who have spent years building a shared life. Marcus was talking about a project he was working on in Baltimore, an affordable housing development that had hit a financing problem. He was frustrated. Victoria was listening. And then she said something that stopped Gerald in the same way the kitchen phone call had stopped him, but for the opposite reason. She said, "You know what I think? I think you keep running into this problem because you're pitching it wrong. You're leading with the community benefit, and these investors are tuning out before you get to the numbers. Lead with the return, get them in the room, then show them the community benefit. People don't sign checks for idealism. They sign checks when idealism happens to be profitable." And Marcus was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's actually exactly right." And then they were quiet together for a moment in the way of people who find each other useful in the best possible sense. Not transactionally useful, but useful the way a good partner is useful, the way someone who sees you clearly and tells you the true thing is useful. Gerald walked to the equipment shed and stood inside it for a while, because what he had just witnessed complicated everything he thought he understood about what was happening. The woman who had said, in that kitchen, that Marcus was a sound investment rather than a love, she was also the woman who just sat with a grieving 74-year-old for 3/4 of an hour and then turned around and gave her partner the most clarifying piece of professional advice he had received in months. These were not performances. These were all real. The question that Gerald now had to sit with was not the one he had arrived with. The question was no longer simply, does she love him? The question had become, what is she doing with whatever it is she feels? Is she a woman who loves a man and has a conflicted relationship with her own feelings about money and security? Or is she a woman who has learned to perform love so convincingly that she has started to fool herself? Gerald did not know. And not knowing, after 3 days, after the kitchen, after the terrace, was harder than a clear answer would have been. Because here is what Gerald Whitfield did not know that weekend. Here is what none of us know when we catch a fragment of someone's worst moment and try to build a portrait from it. Victoria Calloway had grown up in a Memphis apartment where the electricity was cut off 3 times before she was 12 years old, where her mother, who loved her completely and fiercely, sometimes worked 2 shifts back to back and came home so tired she fell asleep at the kitchen table, still in her scrubs, where Victoria learned to make dinner by the time she was 9, and to handle the bill envelopes by the time she was 11, and to smile in a way that did not show the weight she was carrying by the time she was 13. She had watched poverty the way children raised inside it always watch it, not as a temporary condition, not as a plot point in a story that would eventually improve, but as the default state of things, the place you return to if you stop pushing, the undertow that is always there beneath the surface of whatever forward progress you manage to make. She had built her way out of it through intelligence and discipline, and a social intelligence that she had sharpened, without fully understanding she was sharpening it, over years of reading which version of herself each room required. She had learned to be warm when warmth opened doors. She had learned to be sharp when sharpness was what got you taken seriously. She had learned, in a way that no one teaches you but that poverty instructs without asking permission, that people with money are not fundamentally different from people without it, but that they have been conditioned to see the world from a position of security that shapes everything about how they move through it. And she had decided at some point in her early 20s that she was going to move through the world from that position too, not by marrying into it. She had earned her own salary, her own promotions, her own apartment in a city that does not make any of that easy, but by being the kind of woman who belongs in rooms with money and power and who never again has to wonder whether the lights will stay on. What happened with Marcus was real, in the sense that all complicated things are real, partial and true and tangled up with other things. She genuinely liked him. She genuinely respected him. She found him easy in a way that most men she had dated were not, because most men she had dated had egos that required constant management, and Marcus's ego was the quiet kind that does not need to be performed for. He was also, without question, wealthy, and that fact was not separable, in Victoria's interior landscape, from the other facts about him. She could not tell you where the love ended and the security began, because for a woman who had spent her entire life treating security as something that could be snatched away without warning, security had taken on the emotional weight of love. They felt like the same thing. They had always felt like the same thing. That is not a defense. It is an explanation. And it is the explanation that Gerald Whitfield did not have access to as he stood in that equipment shed on a Sunday afternoon in Connecticut, trying to decide what to do with what he knew. By Sunday evening, Gerald had reached a decision, not a clean one, not a certain one, but the only one he could live with. He was going to reveal himself. He was going to do it on Monday morning, before the guests began leaving, while everyone was still present. He was going to step out of the uniform and back into himself and have the conversations that needed to be had. But he was not going to do it as an accusation. He was not going to walk into that dining room and perform a dramatic exposure. He was not built for theater. He was built for direct, private, honest conversation. He was going to speak to Victoria alone. He was going to tell her what he had heard and what he had seen, without cruelty and without ambiguity, and he was going to ask her one question face to face and watch what she did with it. And then, only then, he was going to decide what to tell Marcus. He made one call that evening, from the service wing to Clara. He told her to have a car ready at the estate gate at 7:30 Monday morning, and to have his Navy suit pressed and waiting inside it. Clara, who had worked for Gerald Whitfield for 19 years and had never once been surprised by him in a way that actually surprised her, said understood. He thanked her. He went to sleep at 10 o'clock on a narrow service wing bed in a room he had never slept in before in his own house, under a thin blanket provided by the same staffing supply company that had furnished his uniform, and for the first time in 3 days, he slept through the night. He had done what he came to do. He had the truth. Now came the harder thing, the thing that is always harder than finding out. What you do with what you know, when what you know has the power to break someone your son loves, and when breaking someone is not the same as helping him. Monday morning arrived with the particular quality of light that late autumn mornings in Connecticut carry, low, golden, and brief. Guests were beginning to stir. The kitchen staff was preparing the final breakfast of the weekend. The easy, winding down rhythm of the last morning of a long family gathering had settled over the estate. The relaxed, slightly melancholy energy of people who are not quite ready for the weekend to be over, but can already see the end of it from where they stand. Marcus and Victoria were at the breakfast table by 8 o'clock. She was in a cream cable knit sweater, her hair down. He was in jeans and a flannel shirt, the version of himself he saved for places where he did not have to be anything other than comfortable. They were drinking coffee. They were talking quietly. They were, to any observer, a couple in the ordinary, unhurried ease of a Sunday morning, except that it was Monday and the weekend was ending, and neither of them knew that the ground beneath the next 48 hours was about to shift entirely. At 7:45, Gerald's car came through the estate gate. At 7:50, he was in the guest house adjacent to the main building, changing out of the gray uniform for the last time, buttoning a shirt that had been pressed and waiting for him exactly as requested, putting on a jacket that cost more than some of the weekend guests earned in a month. He stood in front of the mirror in the guest house bathroom for a moment. He was 61 years old. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the lack of sleep. He was about to walk back into his own house as himself for the first time in 3 days and have a conversation that he had been building toward for 8 months. He straightened his jacket. He walked out. The moment he entered the dining room, the energy changed in the way that it always changes when Gerald Whitfield enters a room as himself. It is not something he performs. It is not something he cultivates. It is simply what presence does when it has spent 60 years being built into a person. His sister-in-law Carol looked up from her plate first and said his name, not in greeting, but in the slightly confused tone of someone trying to reconcile what they are seeing with what they expected. Other heads turned, and then, from the far end of the table, Marcus looked up and stopped, and looked at his father the way you look at someone who has just appeared in a place they should not logically be, trying to parse the sequence of events that would explain their presence there. Gerald met his son's eyes from across the table. He smiled, not the smile of a man who has just won something, but the smile of a man who is deeply relieved to be himself again. And then, without sitting down, without taking anything from the breakfast spread, he said, "Marcus, would you and Victoria give me a few minutes?" He looked at Victoria when he said her name, and the way he looked at her, direct, without hostility, without performance, told her, in the space of a single moment, everything she needed to know about what was coming. They sat in the small study off the main hallway, a room Gerald used for reading, lined with books that he had actually read, full of light from 2 south-facing windows. Victoria sat in the chair across from him. Gerald sat at the desk, turned toward her, no barrier between them. He did not open a laptop. He did not produce a recording device. He did not have papers or documents or any of the paraphernalia of a confrontation. He had himself and what he had seen in one question. He started with something Victoria did not expect. He told her about Margaret. He told her the version of Margaret that most people never heard, not the devoted wife, not the supportive partner in the public, managed sense that wealthy families project, but the real version, the woman who told him when he was being a coward, the woman who had sat with him through the worst periods of building the company, when he had made decisions that cost people their jobs and had to live with that. The woman who had, on one specific night in 2003, told him plainly that the version of himself he was performing for the world was not the man she had married, and that if he did not find his way back to the real one, she could not guarantee she would stay. He had found his way back. He told Victoria this not as an illustration of virtue but as context. He needed her to understand who he was before he told her what he knew, because what he knew delivered without context was a weapon, and he had not come to the estate that weekend to destroy anyone. Then he told her. He told her about the kitchen. He told her, with the same measured directness he brought to every consequential conversation of his professional life, exactly what he had heard her say, and to whom and when. He did not inflate it. He did not editorialize. He stated the facts the way a man who has spent his career dealing in the direct truth states them, clearly, without drama, without cruelty, and without any ambiguity about what they meant. And he watched her face, because the face, when the truth lands, does not lie, not in the first second, not in the half second before the performance reassembles itself. Victoria's face, in the half-second before she could manage it, showed not anger and not denial. It showed something older and more private than either of those things. It showed the expression of someone who has been carrying a version of themselves they are not proud of, and who has just been seen carrying it by someone whose judgment they were not prepared to face. She did not deflect. She did not say it was taken out of context. She sat with what he had told her for a long moment, and then she asked a question that Gerald had not anticipated. She asked him why he was telling her this here, privately, before speaking to Marcus. She said, "Most people would have gone straight to him. Why are you talking to me first?" And Gerald said, "Because I wanted to give you the opportunity to be honest before anyone else is in the room. Because what happens between Marcus and you, ultimately, is between Marcus and you. I am his father. I am not his guardian. I cannot make this decision for him, but I will not let him walk into a marriage without knowing what I know. So I am asking you one question, and I need you to answer it for yourself before you answer it to me. Do you love my son, or do you love the life? Because those are not the same thing. And you know the difference, even if you have spent the last few years convincing yourself that you don't." The silence that followed that question lasted long enough that Gerald heard the sound of the household beyond the closed study door, voices from the dining room, the sound of the kitchen, a car door somewhere outside. Victoria did not fill the silence quickly. She sat in it the way people sit in silences that are too full to rush through. And when she spoke, what came out was not the polished, managed version of herself that Gerald had watched perform all weekend. What came out was the other version, the one that had grown up in a Memphis apartment, watching her mother come home from double shifts. She told him she did not know how to separate those two things. She told him that she had spent so long treating security as survival that she genuinely could not locate the place where survival ended and love began. She said, "I know what I said on that phone call. I know how it sounded. I'm not going to tell you I didn't mean it, because I did mean it. But I meant it in the way that people mean things when they are being their most frightened self, not their most honest one. And I don't know if I'm capable of doing better than that. But I know." She paused here. And Gerald said later that her voice changed quality in a way he could not precisely describe. "I know that when I imagine a life without Marcus in it, the thing I feel is not relief. It's loss, real loss. Not the loss of the lifestyle. Him, I would lose him. And that terrifies me more than losing the money ever has." Gerald looked at her for a long time after she said this. Then he said, "That is the most honest thing I have ever heard you say." She looked at him and said, "It is the most honest thing I have ever said." He stood up and she stood up and he said, "Marcus is going to need to hear from you. Not a version of this, all of it. He is not a man who can be managed. He is a man who can be trusted with the truth. And if you trust him with it, you will find out whether what you have is real. And if you don't trust him with it, then you are answering the question yourself." He left the room. Victoria sat back down. She did not move for 11 minutes. Gerald timed it, because he was standing in the hallway outside the door, and he could not make himself walk away. Marcus found out what his father had done before he found out what Victoria had said. That is important, because it means his first reaction was not to the revelation about Victoria. It was to the fact that his father had spent 3 days inside their family home in a janitor's uniform without telling him. He found Gerald on the back terrace, alone, looking out at the property in the thin November light. And the conversation that happened there was one that Gerald has described as one of the hardest of his life. Harder in some ways than the conversation with Victoria, because this was his son. This was the person he had spent 32 years trying to protect from the specific kind of pain he had spent his own life learning to survive. Marcus listened to his father explain what he had done and why without interrupting. Gerald did not soften it. He laid it out plainly, the conversation in the apartment in March, the 8 months of uncertainty, the decision to come to the estate as staff, the things he had observed, the kitchen phone call. He told it like a man who knows that the truth delivered clearly is always more respectful than the truth delivered gently. Because gently implies that the person receiving it cannot handle it. And Marcus could handle it. Gerald knew that. He had raised him to. Marcus was quiet for a long time after Gerald finished. He looked out at the lawn and the bare trees at the property line and the gray November sky above them. He asked one question, "Are you sure about what you heard?" Gerald said, "Yes." Marcus said, "And the other things you watched, the way she was with the staff, the way she was with Aunt Ruth, the conversation on the terrace about the Baltimore project, you saw all of that too?" Gerald said, "I saw all of it." Marcus was quiet again. Then he said, "So she's complicated." Gerald said, "Yes, she is." Mark said, "So am I, so are you." Gerald did not argue with that. because it was true. Marcus pushed back from the railing and said, "I need to talk to her." Gerald said, "I know. And I need to tell you one more thing before you do." She didn't deny it. She didn't perform her way through what I told her. She sat with it. She answered honestly. That doesn't fix what she said, but it tells you something about who she is when the performance stops. Marcus looked at his father for a moment. Then he went back inside. What happened in the sitting room between Marcus Whitfield and Victoria Calloway on that Monday morning has been reconstructed from what both of them have said separately to different people in the time since. They were alone in there for 50 minutes. The other guests had largely dispersed from the main house by that point. Some leaving, some walking the grounds, some in the kitchen. Gerald was on the back terrace. Nobody entered the sitting room. And what emerged from those 50 minutes, by every account, was not a breakup and not a reconciliation in the sentimental movie version of that word. It was something rarer and in some ways harder. An honest conversation between two people who were finally talking about the thing they had both been circling for 3 years without ever actually landing on it. Victoria told Marcus what she had said on the phone. She told him why she had said it. She told him about her mother, about the apartment, about what money had meant to her before he was part of the picture, and what it continued to mean now, even with him in it. Not because she didn't care about him, but because security and love had become so fused in her interior landscape that she genuinely could not tell where one ended and the other began. She said she understood if he couldn't work with that. She said she would not pretend that the version of herself she had shown him was the only version that existed. She had another version. He had now, through his father, heard it, and she thought he deserved to know that both of them were real. Marcus listened to all of it. And then he said something that neither of them had expected him to say. He said, "I've known about the other version. Not specifically. Not what you said on the phone. But I've known there was something underneath the surface that you wouldn't let me see. And I kept waiting for you to trust me enough to show it to me." He looked at her and said, "I still want to know it, if you'll let me." Gerald and Victoria had a second conversation that afternoon, shorter than the first and different in character. Gerald had not planned it. She had come to find him, which was itself significant. She found him in the library, actually reading this time, or trying to, and she sat in the chair across from him without being asked, in the same chair where she had sat that morning, and she said, "I need to tell you something about what Marcus told you, about his father being gone, about why he thought that." Gerald put down his book, she said. "He told me his father had passed away because at the time we met, he was not on speaking terms with you. For about 6 months. A disagreement about the business. He didn't want to explain the whole situation, so he said you were gone. I should have asked more questions. I should have found out the truth. I think on some level I didn't ask because it was easier not to know, and I'm sorry for that." Gerald sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "Marcus didn't tell me he'd told you that." She said, "There's a lot we haven't told each other." He nodded. She said, "I understand if you don't want me in this family." He looked at her for a long moment and then said something that she has never forgotten, that she has repeated to people she trusts, that in a way became the thing, this whole story, all of it, the uniform, the 3 days, the kitchen, the conversations, was ultimately building toward. He said, "I don't know yet what I want for you and my son. That is honest. What I do know is that there are two women inside you that I watched this weekend, and only one of them would have come to find me just now. That woman, the one sitting in this chair, is someone I could learn to trust. Whether you become her or whether you stay her is going to be the whole question of the next few years. I can't answer it for you. I'm not sure you can answer it right now either, but I am willing to wait and see because my son has chosen to. And because his mother, the best judge of character I have ever known, would have sat with you in that chair the same way I am sitting with you right now. And she would have believed that the most important thing about a person is not what they have been. It is what they are capable of becoming." Gerald then handed her an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, 4 pages both sides, written at the service wing desk the previous night in the hours before he slept. It was about Marcus. It was about Margaret. It was about what it means to be trusted with the love of someone who has never once used it against you. Victoria read it alone in the library after Gerald left the room. Nobody saw her face while she read it. Nobody needed to. 6 months after that weekend in Connecticut, Marcus and Victoria were still together. They were in couples therapy, not because things were falling apart, but because Victoria had asked for it. She had said in one of the conversations that came in the weeks following the estate weekend that she wanted to understand herself well enough to be honest about who she was before she made promises to another person about who she would be. That kind of self-awareness, of the kind that comes with cost, is not common. It does not make the past clean. It does not erase the phone call in the kitchen or the years of performance or the gap between the two women that Gerald had watched move through his estate that weekend. But it is the beginning of something. The specific beginning that is only available to people who have been seen completely, the worst and the best of them, in the same 48 hours, and who chose, in the face of being seen, not to run. Gerald Whitfield attended their first therapy session as a couple. Not inside it. He was not invited and would not have come if he had been. But he drove them there. He sat in the car outside for the hour. And when they came out and Marcus opened the back door and said, "You didn't have to wait," Gerald said, "I know." Marcus got in the front seat. Victoria got in the back. They drove to dinner. Nobody talked about the estate. Nobody needed to. The thing that this story is really about, the thing underneath the test, underneath the uniform, underneath the kitchen phone call and the sitting room conversation and the 4-page letter, is not wealth, and it is not betrayal, and it is not even love, exactly. It is the question of who we are when we believe the audience is gone. Most of us spend a significant portion of our lives performing for rooms, performing warmth, performing capability, performing the version of ourselves we have calculated will be most effective in the spaces we need to survive. We learn this young, the way Victoria learned it, the way most of us learn it, not as a deception but as adaptation. The self that gets you through a difficult childhood. The self that opens doors in rooms where the doors are not naturally open to you. The performance that becomes so practiced it starts to feel like the truth until something happens that makes you stand in front of a mirror and ask, in the specific silence of that moment, which version of this is actually me? That question, that terrifying, clarifying question, is the gift that Gerald Whitfield gave his son and gave Victoria at enormous personal cost, in the only way he knew how to give it. He put on a uniform, he made himself invisible, and he waited for the truth to show up on its own. So I want to leave you with a question, not a verdict, not a moral, not a tidy conclusion, because this story does not have one, and the stories worth telling rarely do. The question is this: if someone who loved you put on a disguise, not to trap you, not to humiliate you, but to genuinely see you when you believed no one important was watching, what would they find? Most of us have a kitchen phone call in our history. A moment where we said the thing we actually believed to the one person we trusted to hear it and not hold it against us. Most of us have the gap, the distance between who we are for the right rooms and who we are when we believe the rooms are empty. Gerald Whitfield spent 3 days in that gap. What he found was not a villain. What he found was a complicated woman who had been shaped by a hard life into someone who could not always separate survival from love. And what he chose to do with what he found, not expose, not destroy, not even protect his son in the way a father's fear instructs, but offer a chance at honesty. That choice is the thing worth sitting with. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Gerald made the right call? Should he have gone straight to Marcus the moment he heard that phone call in the kitchen? Or do you think the 3 days mattered? That watching the full picture, the warmth with Aunt Ruth, the conversation on the terrace, the complicated truth of who Victoria was across all of those moments, do you think that changed what he should have done? There is no wrong answer. That is the whole point. This story is not designed to give you a verdict. It is designed to make you think about what you would do with the thing that is hardest to hold, the truth about someone you love. And I want to ask you one more thing. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city, your country, wherever you are in the world, in the comments below. This community is genuinely one of the reasons we keep making videos like this one. Every comment, every response, every person who watches all the way to the end, it matters more than you know. And if you are new here and this story moved you at all, please hit subscribe right now. We release stories like this regularly. Real, human, complicated stories that do not resolve the way they are supposed to and do not leave you where they found you. You do not want to miss what is coming next. Thank you for spending this hour with Gerald and Marcus and Victoria. Thank you for staying with the complicated parts instead of waiting for the simple version. The simple version would have been easier to tell, but you deserve the real one, and so did they.